Now, there we go. So, as I've mentioned, this is the panel one, the 2 o'clock panel one session entitled Animals and Organizations. And we've got 3 really interesting looking papers ahead, which I'm very much looking forward to. Just to quickly, a couple of housekeeping things. I'm sure you're used to this by now, but just to say that we'll have the presentations first, and then we'll have questions at the end. If you do want to ask, or you think of a question and you just want to get it in the chat while the presentations are in progress, a question for the end, I will monitor that and I can ask your question at the end, or you can feel free to ask your question at the end. Otherwise, you're welcome at the end of the 3rd presentation to raise your hand using the raise hand function, or drop something in the chat box. If for any reason you don't want to be recorded, you can just drop a message in the chat box. So all of that said, I will introduce our first speaker, Claire Parkinson, who is a
Richard, are you there?
Yeah, I think we just had a little bit of a tech issue.
I think that we've all just been thrown out of our breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for some reason, it looks like they've all just closed down. So if you
record. Okay, and there we go. So I'll introduce my first speaker, Claire Parkinson. Claire's a professor of media and the co-director of the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill. And Claire's title of her paper is CAS and Media, Critique, Pragmatism and Advocacy. So Claire, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Laura. I'm gonna just get my screen up here. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay. Right. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along to this my talk and to this panel. The title of this paper is CAS and Media. It should be CAS and Media and Communications. It's a little bit long, couldn't really quite fit it on the slide. So CAS and Media, Critique, Pragmatism and Advocacy. So what I wanted to talk about today in this paper is, first of all, the issues that we've had with in a sense, a real lack of engagement from media and communication studies broadly with critical animal studies. And if anybody can hear, that's my dog barking, one of my dogs barking at the most inopportune moment. He likes to join in. So there's been, in terms of the take-up of critical animal studies within media and communication studies, it's been, I would say fairly slow. And in a way, this is strange. And many people query, why is this? And it's difficult to understand. And so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about that, and then about where kind of media and communication studies sits, and how it can sit in relation to critical animal studies. And then I just want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that can be raised, particularly by thinking about this particular conjunction between media and communication studies and critical animal studies, and where that potentially can take us. So just for those people who are not involved in media and communication studies, broadly speaking, the objects of study, if you like, tend to be either the text, the industry, or audience, or some combination of 1, 2 or 3 of those all together, and often involved obviously with some sort of analysis or critique of 1, 2 or 3 of those. And as many people have commented, it seems odd that media and communication studies really hasn't engaged with critical animal studies not in the way that one might expect, particularly when you think about the shared intellectual traditions. So within media and communication studies, there is a tradition of political economy critique, and obviously the critique of representational systems, which you would think would sit very comfortably with critical animal studies. And that's not to say that this sort of work isn't being done, and it certainly is. And I just got a few examples here of the sorts of work that is being done, that is engaging critical animal studies with media and communications. And I think,
sorry to interrupt, so sorry, but
okay.
would you be able to go into presentation mode possibly, just to make the slides a little bigger? That would be brilliant.
Sure, yeah, okay, there we go.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was trying to keep my other side, part of my computer open, just in case I was needed to do something on the lobby side, but it's fine, no, it's fine. Okay, so some examples here. And excuse my huge ego here, because I've actually included 2 of my own books, but this is certainly not, you know, an exhaustive set of examples at all, but I just wanted to add a few examples here to say that the work is being done. But what I think is really interesting with many of these examples is that what you will find is that at the beginnings of many of these books, there is this question of, why is it that this is the first book on this subject that engages with critical animal studies and, you know, whichever aspect of media and communication studies? And so again, there's constantly this kind of questioning, you know, why is it that media and communication studies seems to be particularly late to the party? It seems to be odd. And as I say, it doesn't mean that the work isn't being done. There is work being done, and there's excellent work being done, but maybe not as we might expect, given these kind of shared, as I say, intellectual traditions. And there was an interesting conversation I had quite a few years ago with somebody who was within this field and actually decided that they didn't want to work sort of between critical animal studies and media and communication studies anymore. And when we had a conversation about it, what they said to me was, what's the point? Because it's always anthropocentric. And that's absolutely true. The media as a whole is anthropocentric. It's made by humans for humans. It's commercial media, particularly, obviously we think about it as a capitalist enterprise, and other animals have suffered greatly under capitalism in ways that have been normalized by commercial media. And when we think about the sorts of texts that are out there, film, television, you know, take your pick, what we have there is what we might think of as low-hanging fruit. If we're going to view it through a critical animal studies lens, certainly pretty much everything out there can be critiqued, and we can obviously, you know, think about how it doesn't address animals as individuals, sentient, and so on, and actually supports in many ways the animal industrial complex. So media texts are really kind of what I've said here. They're a sort of low-hanging fruit. They're very easy for us to critique, and pretty much everything that's out there, we can, you know, we can find some way of being critical of it if we're coming from a CAS perspective. And that leaves us in, I think, quite an interesting position, because yes, there's a lot for us to critique, but then what do we do with this? So we can, of course, critique these texts, and I'm certainly not in this presentation saying that critique is not important. Of course, it's absolutely crucial in terms of what we do. But what I'm looking for, and what I'm trying to give some examples of today in this presentation, are ways in which we can find a space to have critique, but also to find places where the existing structures that we may indeed critique and find uncomfortable and that we disagree with, but how could we use those strategically for advocacy? So what I'm trying to think about today in this presentation is how we bring together critique with a degree of pragmatism. And some of the examples that I'm going to give you are where we've done, or I and some colleagues have done research, and the findings have perhaps been uncomfortable. From a CAS perspective, the findings are maybe not what we might want to hear. And so what do we do with that? How can we use it? Do we need to just critique everything and literally put it to one side and say, okay, you know, it's just there to be criticized, and we need to have, you know, some sort of idealized kind of view of media and communications? I mean, clearly we can't do that, because it's going to be a long time, if ever, before we get to something that is appreciative of or understands animals as sentient and is opposed to all forms of suffering. So there's a lot to critique, but what do we do with that critique? Where can we introduce a degree of pragmatism? And as I say, I'm not here trying to, again, sort of say that critique in and of itself is bad. It's not. It's something crucial. It's something that we need to obviously be engaged with. But how do we draw that in? How do we move to that CAS perspective where we are invested in a praxis where we bring together the critique with activism, recognition of intersecting oppression, and we can do it perhaps in a more pragmatic way? I've got a quote here from Kim Stallwood around this idea that we need to balance off this kind of idealistic vision with a pragmatic politics, and I think that Kim's quite right about that. And you may disagree with it. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about today potentially are quite controversial from a CAS perspective. So let's see, off we go. We'll give it a go and see what you think. So I've argued this before, and one of the things that I've written about and talked about, and if you were at the EACAS conference in 2019, you may have heard me speak about this. I've talked before about anthropomorphism and the ways in which we need to engage with anthropomorphism. I'm just giving this as one example. I give some more examples a little bit further through this presentation. But I've criticized this idea that anthropomorphism is something which, yes, it's contentious from a CAS perspective, but we need to stop treating it as this monolithic problem. And we need to find a way, I've argued, to critique it, and also then to be able to deploy it for advocacy purposes. So what I've done is I've argued that we need to think of anthropomorphism in different ways. And I've argued that we can think about it as being differentiated and situational, contextual and entangled. And I developed this idea of these 4 sites of anthropomorphism. And each of these is a way of thinking about anthropomorphism. And my argument is that it is not about seeing just one of these, but actually finding that they're entangled. And indeed, each of these can actually exist at the same time. So they can all exist together. So when we think about anthropomorphism, I've suggested that it can be this intersubjective imagining of another's experience, that we can think about it in relation to affective labor from a critical perspective. And this is where we use anthropomorphism and the labor of other animals as a kind of way of giving us some comfort, but from an anthropocentric perspective. And then from these pejorative sites where anthropomorphism is thought of in a negative way, and it's actually used to reclaim or assert some sort of authority of an anthropocentric position about non-human animals. And then finally the 4th site, which is this kind of commodified, the commodified site, which is where anthropomorphism is used in service to capitalism, and it encourages those humans to engage with it as customers who are viewing a product rather than seeing the non-human animal themselves. But what I'm saying is that for each of these different sites of anthropomorphism, they can be entangled. So we can have a situation where we have, for example, a representation that is a representation that we can think of critically as being commodified, as being an example of affective labour, but also can function in an empathetic sense as well. So I'm going to kind of reintroduce this idea of anthropomorphism a little bit later on in the presentation and give a couple of examples of how that's been used by animal advocacy organisations. So this is one of the ways in which I want to kind of escape from this idea that we critique alone and we can actually, there is actually ways in which we can find sort of ways through and ways that we can use what might be thought of as existing structures of oppression, and we can actually turn those around and use them for advocacy. And so I just want to take us on to another piece of research that I was involved with actually a few people who are here at the conference today. And this was the Pathways to Veganism project. It was run by me and Richard Twine, who's the other co-director of the Centre for Human Animal Studies. Lara, who is chairing the panel today, was also involved as well. And she was one of the researchers on the project. And should also mention Naomi Griffin and Claire Blennerhasser as well, who are not here today, but were also part of the project. This was a project that was funded by the Vegan Society, and what we did was we were examining the public reception of different kinds of pro-vegan messages, and we were looking at how non-vegans responded to them, and we also looked at the cultural meanings that were attached to meat, dairy and other animal products. So over the course of the project, which lasted for just over a year, we did a literature review. We had a questionnaire that we had just over 1,600 respondents. Once we'd filtered those down, it was around 1,550. We conducted 50 face-to-face interviews in 10 focus groups with more than 70 participants. And the outputs from that were the Pathways to Veganism report, then there was a Pathways to Veganism follow-on report, and then a Pathways to Veganism toolkit. And the toolkit we sent out to a whole range of different organisations in 2020. And what I want to talk about is the ways in which, was first of all the findings, and I've picked out some findings that perhaps are not particularly comfortable for us from a critical animal studies perspective, but I want to talk about how those were then incorporated into the advocacy campaigns for two different organisations. So in terms of the findings.
Claire, that's 5 minutes remaining. Just
okay, I will run through them very quickly. So some findings that were a little uncomfortable for everybody concerned was that non-vegans were particularly receptive to health and environmental messages, but they did not like animal ethics messages. Family dynamics were very important, and so this in a way challenges this idea that as individuals, you know, we can transition to veganism, and that there won't be any kind of great challenges to that because this is, you know, we're autonomous individuals. But what we found was actually family dynamics played a much greater role than people had maybe perhaps thought. We had insights into who were credible communicators of vegan messages, and it turned out that the people that were trusted were sports people, health professionals, and some academics, and within certain contexts. But there was a huge distrust of vegan and animal advocacy groups, even if the message that they were giving was scientifically accurate. Another slightly uncomfortable finding was that people responded to animal imagery in different ways, and we identified a hierarchy of animal imagery, and the female participants engaged in the kind of anthropomorphized parent-child imagery and responded to it, we would say, very positively. And also one of the key findings was that the majority of people actively disengaged from any kinds of distressing animal imagery and the pro-vegan narratives that were there to make us feel guilty. I'm just going to run through very quickly how this then was incorporated into the work of the Vegan Society and also Animal Equality. The Vegan Society actually used the findings as part of their Vegan and Thriving campaign. And so one of the outcomes of this was that ITN made a mini documentary, and that highlighted very much the health sides of things, and it used vegan sports people and dietitians as advocates and communicated the health and environmental messages. And the campaign was incredibly successful, and it reached the target of it achieved this objective of targeting an older audience, which is thought of as very difficult to reach with pro-vegan messages. The campaign video had over 10,000 views, and the website's 13,500 in the first 6 weeks it went live. And the feedback from the Vegan Society was that the information was well received and that people felt positively towards veganism as a result. There was also the Future Normal campaign, and this is where the hierarchy of animals was used. The campaign avoided emotional manipulation, didn't use vegan celebrities, and it used anthropomorphism as well, but in certain ways. So there was a key message about remembering how people loved animals during childhood, and it also used a lot of imagery that conveyed a kind of family dynamic, parent-child relationship. Again, the Future Normal campaign, the feedback we had from the Vegan Society was that, and this was to reach people who were not yet vegan but thought of themselves as animal lovers. The campaign film had around 2 million views, and the website 78,000 within the first 2 months of live activity. And then very quickly onto Animal Equality. And again, people may have seen this. This is quite a recent, in fact, it's still a current campaign at the moment. And their expose of the Scottish salmon slaughterhouse abuses. And so what they did, they changed their campaign. They placed a greater emphasis on scientific opinion. They coordinated an open letter, and that was signed by more than 40 academics. And the key thing that they did was they asked Alexander Gould, who was the voice of Nemo in Finding Nemo, if he would back the campaign. And this was, again, leveraging this idea of an anthropomorphic film character to make a connection to real life animals. And Animal Equality have reported to us that they've actually had a lot of success with this campaign. And key to this has been receiving a lot of broadsheet and popular press coverage and support for the campaign, which they said that they wouldn't have had perhaps otherwise if they'd have run the campaign in a slightly different way. So to conclude then very quickly, some of the findings that we had were perhaps a very uneasy fit with a critical animal studies position. But I'm going to argue that actually it's still important that we try and use those, perhaps what we might think of as existing structures, and some of those uneasy fits come out of those existing structures, but we still need to use those strategically for advocacy, and that it's important that we adopt a range of different strategies. So again, just to remind you of Kim Stallwood, and he said that we need to balance that utopian vision with a pragmatic politics. And apologies if I've just run over.
No, you did really well to catch up with yourself there. Thank you so much, Claire. Really fascinating. Yeah. I say it as partly involved.
You're in the team, slightly, Laura.
Feels slightly. But thank you so much. I think that will feed really nicely into our next speaker, or our next paper. where we have two for the price of one, two speakers, Jess Hooper and Carol Kline. Jess is an anthrozoology, sorry, we've just been talking about anthropomorphism. She's an anthrozoology PhD student at the University of Exeter. And Caroline Kline is an associate professor at Appalachian State University in the USA. And their paper title is Saving Animals or Saving Face, an analysis of animal rights and tourism, animal rights and tourism industry partnerships in promoting ethical animal tourism. So whenever you're ready, Jess, are you?
Perfect, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
I'll try and share it now. Is that working?
Perfect.
Yeah, lovely. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, indeed, we are going to be talking to you today about our paper, it's still in progress, called Saving Animals or Saving Face, an analysis of animal advocacy and tourism industry corporate partnerships in promoting ethical animal tourism. So first of all, it's important to note that animals appear in the tourism sector in a variety of ways. They appear in circuses, road shows, even in hotels, all the way up to industries such as the zoo industry, safaris, ecotourism experiences. So the conditions that animals find themselves in can vary really, really widely. And so do the ethical issues and the welfare concerns that arise from animals involved in these contexts. So traditionally and historically, the narrative surrounding the ethics of animal tourism has been fairly similar to those expressed in the animal rights narrative. So typically there's a binary rhetoric in which humans and animals are placed separate to each other in a deontological approach to ethics in which the animals should be left alone, free from human interference. So we see this similarly in popular news media portrayals of animals in tourism. So organizations that prioritize human entertainment, such as Sea Life, so SeaWorld and the orca shows, those ones are condemned for animal cruelty. But in comparison, ecotourism experiences are generally supported for their pro-conservation benefit or their perceived conservation benefit. So this dichotomy is quite problematic. It doesn't address the nuances involved in the animal's experience, but animal rights theory has been fundamental for raising awareness of the unethical treatment of animal in tourism. Now, however, we are beginning to see an emergence of corporate partnerships between animal advocacy groups and the industries within the tourism sector. So by working directly with large corporations, advocacy groups can directly shape the company's animal welfare policies. They can also gain financial assistance through brand affiliation. So while the affiliation with corporate enterprises might project a strength of manipulation, and it does shift focus from the individual to institutional action, which I'd argue is always a good thing, brand affiliation can actually also risk the appropriation of the symbolism held by animal advocacy groups. So this process is akin to greenwashing, in which companies are promoting an ethical veneer of environmental concern, whilst actually they continue to place profit over the planet. So it's for this reason that animal advocacy organizations, we are arguing, must be really careful when they select their partners. And we're arguing this in order to ensure that the ethics of animal advocacy groups are upheld and not actually diluted. So on to our aims then. In order to assess this and strengthen the partnerships between animal advocacy groups and the tourism sector, we conducted a two-phase research approach. Firstly, we investigate the strengths and the limitations to two current partnerships, the partnership between Born Free and British Airways, and the partnership between World Animal Protection and Airbnb. From our research, the next phase that we will conduct is to create a framework that animal advocacy and tourism organisations can apply in order to form a mutual agenda that best prioritises the lives of animals. And like we said, like without diluting those ethics. So onto our analysis then. The partnership between Born Free and British Airways was announced in August 2019, and they did this with the launch of the British Airways new animal welfare policy. So this is a policy that states a commitment to, and I quote, never promoting wild animals in captivity. As such, all of their attractions where animal captivity was the focus, such as SeaWorld, were removed from their website. They also wanted to promote transparency regarding wild animals featured in hotels. It is worth noticing, though, at this point that animals that are housed in hotels are still promoted on the British Airways website. They're just labelled. So they're still there. People can still purchase tickets and they can still book rooms in these hotels that feature wild animals, but there is a little label to say that there are wild animals in these institutions. So British Airways also pledged to support the expansion of Born Free's big cat sanctuary in South Africa. They paid for a perimeter fence, and they also used their airline to transport animals there for them. They also support the Raise the Red Flag initiative, which is an online platform where the public can report tourist activities that involve cruelty to animals. So for a red flag to be raised, the attraction must be in breach of animal welfare. The requirements for these breaches are outlined on the Born Free website. Now, the first thing we wanted to do was take a look at the real ethics behind the animal advocacy groups. So Born Free's mission statement, and I quote, is to conserve and protect wild animals, natural habitats and functioning ecosystems in perpetuity, and to end any activities that exploit and negatively impact wild animals, whether living in captivity or in the wild. So to this effect, a partnership with an airline may be seen as antithetical to this objective. Aviation is the single largest contributor to climate change within the tourism industry, equating to about 3% of global emissions. Indeed, in November 2019, which was just 3 months after their partnership with Born Free was publicly announced, the BBC exposed British Airways for generating an excess of 18,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide in 2018 alone. This was done through a process called fuel tinkering, where they carry far more fuel on board than they need to in order to save money, because they don't then need to refuel in other countries. Unfortunately for them, it only actually saves about £40 per flight. So British Airways was condemned by environmental charities for putting profit before planet, claiming that the airline industry approaches their responsibilities towards climate change like a PR problem. So the focus of Born Free's efforts to truly conserve and protect animals, natural habitats and functioning ecosystems in perpetuity means that they can't really overlook the impact of global warming. Particularly for an organisation who oppose animals in captivity and prefer to see animals in their wild state. And so we surely need to protect wild environments. So we also took a closer look at the Raise the Red Flag initiative. It highlighted some limitations. Namely, that hotels featuring captive wild animals are still endorsed on the British Airways website, but they don't seem to feature on the Raise the Red Flag platform. We took a section from the UK to see what types of attractions were actually named, and we found that the majority of them, in fact, pretty much all of them, were accredited zoos. So of 55 UK animal attractions in the UK that were assigned red flags, 52 of these were zoological collections operating legally under the auspices of the Zoo Licensing Act 1981 and the Secretary of State Standards of Modern Zoo Practice. 38 of these were also accredited by BIASA, which expect higher levels of accountability towards animal welfare and conservation than you would expect as the minimum requirements in the legislation. Now, we're not trying at this point to defend zoos or zoo legislation in any way. We're just simply pointing out the confusion as to why animals in zoos are listed, but animals in hotels aren't. And if an animal encounter, which is what these breaches claim to be, if an animal encounter is considered to be cruel, then why does British Airways continue to promote hotels on their website which feature wild animals? Animals which won't be protected by the same standards of welfare legislation as animals housed in zoos, who are unlikely to be cared for by animal welfare professionals, and whose only purpose is to serve as entertainment rather than the objectives of education and conservation. So such inconsistencies in agenda risks taking focus away from helping animals and actually undermines the true animal advocacy. So I'm going to pass you over now to Carol.
Thank you, Jess. The second partnership that we looked at was between World Animal Protection and Airbnb. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this group that World Animal Protection has been in existence for some time. The roots trace back to 1950. So it has been doing animal protection work in some form for over 70 years. It works globally, as the name implies, and most impressively to me, it addresses many forms of animal abuse all at the same time. Animals in the wild, animals in farming, animals in communities, and animals in disaster. 2 years ago, World Animal Protection and Airbnb launched a new program to be touted on the Airbnb site, Animal Experiences. Jess, if you could go back to the previous slide. The program was a further refinement of Airbnb's Experiences program, which was a major expansion from its original offerings to live like a local through staying at the homes of regular old people like me. Moving from lodging to, in theory, any type of intangible offering where you can connect directly with a local tour guide or a small tea house was a major move in shortening the tourism supply chain. Since the dawn of OTAs, or online travel agencies, around 1995, travelers have enjoyed the control of researching, choosing, and booking their own travel arrangements, which comes without the hassle and perceived cost of the bricks and mortar intermediaries. Now, Airbnb was not only offering the opportunity to care for rescued donkeys, have tea with naughty sheep, learn beekeeping, kayak with aquatic conservationists, but it's actually dangling it there right in front of you on their website, enticing you to book. World Animal Protection has been developing animal welfare standards and policies for years. They were the first organization that I'm aware of to come out with an official statement against animal selfies, which figures prominently within tourism, educating the public and encouraging us all to take the wildlife selfie pledge. The animal experiences on Airbnb include many standards you would expect. No direct contact with wildlife, no animal performances, no captive marine animals, no selfies. Working animals must not be overworked. Nothing that includes illegal wildlife trade. And they condemn activities such as the purchase of wildlife products, such as ivory, shark fin, soup, and Jess, you'll be happy to hear, civet coffee. There are over 1,000 animal experiences offered on the Airbnb platform all over the world. And I was very interested to learn that the Dodo, a media platform which specializes in cute animal videos, is partnering with World Animal Protection and Airbnb to highlight a number of these experiences. When Airbnb actually adopted these policies, they had to cut loose around 5% of the animal-based attractions and tours it was currently offering. Okay, so here I just wanted to show you an official policy statement that introduces more detailed parameters of Airbnb's animal welfare policy. And on the next slide, I have World Animal Protection's take on their partnership. As they said, this is a major event in the tourism industry, and one that we will hopefully be able to point to down the road, that this was a starting point where we started to shift the public's and the industry's discourse on animal-based tourism. In my opinion, this meta-level event of having Airbnb and World Animal Protection team up has more substance than, to say, TripAdvisor's policy of removing the sale of dolphin, shows and elephant riding practices, but then still allowing people to comment about how great these experiences are. But Airbnb is certainly not without fault. They've run into a number of issues at the local level and site-specific level. Since not all of these are animal-specific, I'll only touch on them to give you a flavor of how the Airbnb system can foster trouble and the difficulties of ensuring delivery of a positive product from each and every single listing of the thousands and thousands listings on its site. Okay, so for example, people who are eager to earn additional income through the Airbnb, a side hustle, sometimes the listings could be violating local laws and policies. There have been lots and lots of anecdotal evidence that the traffic that is generated by Airbnb activities through neighborhoods, apartment buildings, and towns is far from welcome from the residents. And the residents have been complaining about this. In some ways, by allowing visitors to book directly with locals, one could argue that Airbnb circumvents local job opportunities that the larger lodging properties provide. And staying in a house or apartment where you can cook many of your meals does take away revenue from the dining sector of a community, which employs lots of people. Airbnb has also in the past perpetuated avoidance of occupancy tax payments, like many of the online travel agencies. And the occupancy tax is the lifeblood of tourism. In some destinations, it feeds into the general tax structure, contributing to community infrastructure projects like road maintenance or community arts projects. One of the loudest complaints that we've seen about Airbnb so far, though, has been a swell of charges about 5 years ago about racism at a local level. So for example, I, as a white woman, might show my property as available during certain dates until that I see you, a Black or brown person, wants to book my property. And then in that case, I reverse my position to let you know that it is not, in fact, available anymore. It is at this point, I really need to stick up for the tourism industry for just a moment, because tourists can be incredibly annoying and in many cases disrespectful. The outside wealth that tourism can bring to a community can offset thousands of dollars of taxes that each resident might have to contribute to get the same level of services in tourism tax revenue. Relative to animals, there are many communities in economically developing nations that have adopted a more conservation-based ethic, if only to conserve conservation biodiversity as a resource for income generated through tourism. You will find no greater critic of the exploitive nature of tourism than me, a tourism professor. But the industry can and has done a whole lot of good in terms of preserving traditions, reconstituting natural and heritage sites, and putting food on the table of impoverished individuals.
So that's 3 minutes remaining. Sorry, Carol, 3 minutes. Cheers.
That's great. That's great. So taking a closer look at Airbnb, you would suspect that they have some other issues to address. For example, they didn't develop a sustainability program until last year, 2020. The elements of their sustainability plan are fine, including the discussion of principles and metrics for their various stakeholders. However, we would argue that to hold a progressive stance, they would include animals and even nature as a stakeholder. They do seem to have learned from past mistakes and have a firm grip on their ethos of inclusivity. However, it seems that they have adopted a typical, rigid, anthropocentric view of who their stakeholders are. Therefore, the sustainability metrics that they're employing flow directly from that, omitting accountability towards animals as individuals or as a species. Really, the only thing that we found in their sustainability plan that relates to animals is that they, and I quote, are measuring carbon footprint of both Airbnb's corporate operations and the carbon footprint of travel facilitated by the Airbnb platform. That is a big thing to measure, and so it'll be interesting to see what they report. They will report, they're expanding their community-focused initiatives to offer grants to Airbnb communities, so perhaps some of these awards will go towards animal-focused projects. And in April of just this year, they're starting to work with Environmental Defense Fund and an organization called Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance Coalition, which is a public-private initiative seeking to raise $1 billion to prevent tropical deforestation. So just let's fast forward ahead. Keep going. Yeah, there we go. And so while we are looking at world animal protection and Airbnb, and Jess and I have had these discussions between these two partnerships, we are in the process of developing a framework. The framework will be sort of an outline of principles that these partnerships should look to in order to adopt the best practices. Because the tourism industry is complex and animal protection involves so many issues and many species and cultures, we hope the framework will begin in harnessing what best practices might look like for these high-level partnerships. We would hate to see the brand or the integrity of the animal NGOs compromised by working with an industry that is so fragmented and as a result, hard to manage. However, we recognize the potential major impacts that these partnerships can have and want to help guide future collaborations. For better or for worse, the tourism industry is not going away. We are encouraged by these partnerships that we're seeing relative to environmental action and animal protection. We hope that the analysis that we are doing of these mega relationships will provide a prompt for other industry members and NGOs to develop their own and to look inward to ensure the partnerships adhere to the principles outlined in our coming framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both to Carol and to Jess, for that really fascinating, if not somewhat sobering presentation. Thank you so much. I'm sure that will spark a lot of conversation in our discussion at the end. Thank you. And so we move then on to our third and final speaker in this panel, and that's Sezen, Ergin, Zengin from Hacettepe University. Is that close enough? I've been practicing, believe it or not.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Amazing.
Okay. Yay. So Sezen's PhD dissertation investigated changing power relations between humans and animals through an analysis of discourse, and her research and publications concern the manifestation and legitimization of power through discourse in a wide array of topics. And her paper today is entitled A Promising Start, The Case of Critical Animal Studies in Turkey. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Lara. So hello, everyone. My name is Sezen Zengin, and I'm from Hacettepe University, Turkey. I plan to talk about critical animal studies in Turkey, but I will mostly concentrate on the scholars in the field and their discovery of the field and motivations for publishing in this field. So to remind you where Turkey is, it is in Europe, it is in Asia, it is in the Middle East. We might say it is home to identity crisis. So let me show you my outline. So first, I will give a piece of introductory information on the status of critical animal studies in Turkey. Then I will shortly explain the study I conducted, followed by the results of the study grouped under themes. I didn't want to include a separate overview of political, cultural, and socioeconomic atmosphere in Turkey. Rather, I will incorporate them into the findings of the study where needed. I will then share how these scholars view media and veganism. Lastly, I will talk about some suggestions for the development of the field. So, critical animal studies is a burgeoning study field in Turkey. However, there are still no departments, no major minor programs, no graduate programs and research centers under the name of critical animal studies. There are no undergraduate and graduate courses titled critical animal studies, but scholars in this field are incorporating the the tenets of the field into other courses, such as political ecology, eco-criticism, environmental history, and many others for a long time. There's a growing number of publications each and every day. The majority of them can be categorized under environmental humanities, posthumanism, and eco-criticism, in which English language and literature is at the forefront. Also, it is safe to say that the number of theses and dissertations written in the field is on the rise as well. Again, most of them are from English language and literature. So this is a qualitative study. I have conducted semi-structured interviews with scholars from the field. Publications in the field were decisive when choosing them. I did internet searches, but certain intellectual periodicals with special issues on animals guided me in finding these names. I sent out emails to them, and 17 scholars accepted to participate, and they are from the following disciplines. So sociology, English language, literature. Interviews through Zoom lasted approximately 40 to 75 minutes. I recorded the interviews and coded them, and certain themes emerged during the analysis. They were not predetermined, but of course I had some expectations. Themes that I've established are not mutually exclusive. They are interrelated, and there are no similar studies in Turkey. So these are my themes. They are the most salient ones: commonality of oppressions, activism and change, motivation and destruction. So let me start with the first one. Okay, motivations. So I was really curious to know what sparked their interest in this field. So some researchers told me that it was really an academic interest at first. They wanted to concentrate on the challenges and gaps in their disciplines. But then in time, when they consumed the literature, they adopted a critical approach and transformed their relationship with other animals. They went vegetarian, vegan, or got involved in activism. Other researchers weren't interested in the field first, but then they encountered the miserable conditions of stray dogs and their treatment, their deaths, or adopted a non-human animal, or witnessed the pain of other animals such as fish. So these encounters and or adopting a companion animal and witnessing their subjectivity firsthand ignited a spark, which in turn made them question the anthropocentric paradigm. And then they went on to invest in this field. So here I want to talk a bit about stray animals in Turkey, because it is quite uncommon in the West. And I think stray animals make up an important part of our society, physically and mentally. So there are approximately 10 million stray dogs and cats in Turkey. From what I experienced, the majority of the human population just tolerate their existence. Only a minority are actively involved in protecting and feeding them. They are mostly women, and they are generally seen as crazy ladies. So unfortunately, municipalities and the government don't really offer much to protect them. On the contrary, there are illegal killings linked to municipalities. It is common to find dogs thrown away to non-residential areas such as forests, where they eat each other or starve to death, or they get locked in shelters, which are no different than torture camps. Because of our anthropocentric culture and religion, Islam, stray animals are seen as inferior, filthy, dangerous, and out of control. Media often portrays them as threats to humans. So these images are also transferred to minorities as well. Syrian refugees are often likened to dogs, stray dogs, among other animals. In fact, the word dog is a common slur in Turkish. So animal encounters are very frequent in Turkey. I mean, as a kid, I used to play with dogs and cats all the time, but most of the time children are discouraged to play with them. With this background, scholars in Turkey, especially interested in urban sociology, are quick to notice the entanglements of humans and other animals. That's why I've heard personal stories around stray dogs and cats. But scholars also study pigeons and draught animals such as mules, horses, and cows as well. A common theme, another theme that has been brought up in almost every interview was the commonality of oppressions. Many scholars have already been dealing with power relationships and inequality in various spheres. Majority of the scholars were espousing a feminist approach in their works, and many of them were studying minorities, refugees, and other subordinated groups. They were already trying to dismantle oppressive systems such as sexism, racism, and capitalism. Thus, it is no wonder that almost all scholars were identified with political left. A sensitivity to these issues, I guess, creates a foundation for noticing oppression in human-animal relations as well. So now let me give you a snapshot of the political atmosphere. Turkey has been ruled by Justice and Development Party, a conservative right-wing party since 2002, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So it is hard to summarize last 18 years, but it will be enough for now to say that Turkey has been less secular and more Islamist since then. With a highly authoritarian president, Turkey is rapidly moving away from democratic values. A crumbling economy, rising unemployment, and serious human rights violations have become the norm. So a very concerning step was the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, which aimed at combating and preventing violence against women and domestic violence. So this decision unfortunately encourages violence against women, which has become a common aspect of daily life. Women are murdered every day, mostly by their husbands, ex-husbands, or boyfriends. Recent protests were also about the appointment of the rector of Boğaziçi University by Erdogan. Students and academics have been protesting since, demanding an elected rector. So these students were called terrorists, and many were detained and subjected to police violence and strip searches. The discrimination against minorities is also widespread. In the first photograph, you see Syrian refugees. The second photo on the right shows an attack to the headquarters of HDP, a party that mostly represents Kurdish people. A recent tweet from a member of parliament called party members as pests, which must be terminated. So on the left, you see Alevi houses that are being targeted. Alevis are Muslims, but they are religious minorities in Turkey. On the right, you see the Roboski massacre. This photo was the least disturbing, so sorry about that. 34 Kurds and 59 mules were killed by airstrike. They were smugglers, but Turkish Air Force thought that they were terrorists. As you can see, academia in Turkey cannot detach itself from social issues, and animal and human fates are quite similar. So another theme is destruction. Ecological destruction has been brought up by many scholars as well. Caste scholars in Turkey oppose to the objectification, commodification of nature and animals. They stand up against systems of exploitation, which see nature and animals through profit-driven agendas. The majority of scholars take an interest in the climate crisis because they see it as an urgent matter that needs to be addressed immediately. So publications in the field are therefore seen as reactions to the consequences of anthropogenic activities, which have led to many ecological disasters and extinctions. These scholars underline that humans are not superior to nature or detached from it as dictated by the dominant paradigm. We are part of the same ecosystem, and when that system fails, the humanity is doomed. So the urgency is quite visible in Turkey due to reckless plundering of forests and natural resources. Here again, I want to give some examples. You may have heard of the mucilage in the Marmara Sea, spreading to the Black Sea and Aegean Sea as well. The sea is choking due to pollution and global warming. The bottom of the sea is filled with dead fish. Our forests are at a constant risk too. Mining licenses are given to foreign companies which cut down millions of trees trees and extract our natural resources, leaving behind toxic substances and devastated lands. So our president is all about huge projects such as the third airport in Istanbul, or crazy projects such as Istanbul Canal, which are detrimental to the ecosystem, wild animals and humans as well, because the region is a high-risk earthquake zone. And we are building nuclear power plants when Europe is phasing them out. Okay, another theme is activism and change. For the most part, ties to activism in academia are quite weak in CAS. But I have to say, feminist academics have been taking action in terms of women's rights for years. A common concern is that when activism is foregrounded, their publications will be subjected to criticism and will be questioned. However, for others, academics are needed in activism because they could easily see an issue from different perspectives and encourage a calm and reasonable approach. Activism is a must, but we must strike a balance. Also, publishing and teaching in a marginal study field, which would risk your academic career, is a type of activism for some. So due to the rise of social movements, many scholars underline an atmosphere of change. For now, CAS is carried out by personal efforts, but in time, like feminist approaches, which were marginalized 10 years ago, critical animal studies will be seen as a legitimate field of study.
5 minutes remaining. Oh,
okay.
sorry.
Thank you, Lara. For the most part, ties to activism in academia are quite weak in CAS, but I have to, So first, let me say about media. Many scholars don't follow mainstream media. The media is considered apolitical. It only chooses companion animals as news materials. The news stories are mostly about violence to stray dogs and cats, with perpetrators portrayed as deviant psychopathic people. Other animals are almost never featured in the news, and exploitative systems are never questioned. Only a fraction of the plight of animals are represented. Animals that are eaten are easily overlooked. Media in Turkey is generally seen as ineffective in bringing change to society, but maybe that's on us. Academia in Turkey is far from producing knowledge that is in the interests of the public. Social media, on the other hand, or platforms like Netflix, where you can watch documentaries such as Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, and the like, are seen as gates to real social change. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook are really popular in Turkey, and they are successfully used by activist platforms for making their voice heard, which are otherwise silenced by the mainstream media. So lastly, I will talk about veganism and then sum up the presentation. So many of the researchers in the field were vegans or vegetarians. Some became vegan many years ago after reading Peter Singer or Carol J. Adams, myself included. Being a vegetarian or vegan was the reason they got interested in CAS for some scholars. And veganism in society is most seen as an elite pastime devoid of any political meaning. And news on the recently opened vegan butcher made veganism more visible. So to sum it up, Turkey fails in human rights. Thus, human-animal issues are mainly seen as marginal. Personal efforts in CAS opens up new possibilities in Turkey. The field is constantly growing, and veganism is seen as an elite pastime, not a political issue. So what should be done? So collaboration is key, of course, at an international level, but we even do not collaborate at a national level, apart from environmental humanities and post-humanism, which is quite strong in Turkey. Establishing common venues for sharing opinions is needed. That can be conferences and workshops. A cooperation between academia and activists are more than necessary. Related to that, we have to take more concrete steps. Be active, try to come up with solutions and strategies rather than tackling with philosophical issues. And the most influential one is offering courses in the field, which will then hopefully turn into programs and research centers. So you get instant feedback in the courses, unlike publications. There is a pressing need for more translated material and also original work written in Turkish. And to be more inclusive, we need to prioritize problems, not political labels. We need to mobilize popular culture, you know, novels on human-animal relations, rap music, for instance, for making animal liberation visible. And veganism must be a political movement, not a dietary regime. So thank you so much for listening. This is my boy, Minish. He was helping me out with the interviews as well. So thank you so much. I see CAS scholars as my family. I'm sending virtual hugs to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sezen. What a lovely way to end your project then. And some really fascinating insights. Thank you so much for that look into something that I certainly was unaware of. And I hope that I see such connections between all three papers, and hopefully that we can draw some of those out in our discussion now. So I'm aware that my timekeeping has made us run over, so I'm going to go straight to questions. Does anyone, there hasn't been anything in the text chat, so if anyone wants to raise their virtual hand or shout out. Oh, and sorry, just to ask, if you don't mind turning your camera on, please do, so that it makes us feel a little bit more like we're in a room together and not many miles apart. Obviously no pressure, but that would be brilliant. Any questions? I have questions, but I will open it up to the floor to start off with. But okay, no, good. I'll take it away then. This is a question for everyone, one that has in ways been answered in your papers to some extent, particularly in Claire's. But I'm just wondering about, because with all three papers, it was really kind of clear, and possibly it was almost frustrating that that there are kind of massive discrepancies and or lackings, and you know, a kind of a real sort of failure of the various systems that all three papers made reference to. And it seems particularly frustrating coming at it from this particular angle with incredibly talented academics who are able to use their experience and expertise to identify these things. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe like the gap between academia and industry in that sense, and what we can do. This is why I know Claire, you did speak about how, you know, making the toolkit, and that did have that kind of impact that obviously is the ideal situation. And I basically want the other two papers to change the world. I want all three papers to change the world, please. Is that a question? Possibly. Did that sound like a question? What is that, speaking from your particular industries, can you speak to the kind of maybe the gap between academia and industry, and if and how that gap might be lessened, if not bridged? Or is that,
I can start. I hate silences, so I'm just going to speak. So I think that the way that it's going to be most effective for us to start is to have interdisciplinary, or what I like to call transdisciplinary approaches to research. So for example, myself and Carol, we come from very different academic backgrounds, very different industry backgrounds, but actually it means that we can approach a topic where animal advocacy, which we both support, we can approach it from what we said in the paper, like a two-pronged approach. And that's got to be where we start, surely. And it's through those types of collaborations, whether it's with social sciences, with biological sciences, or whether it's artists with social scientists, it's through those interdisciplinary collaborations that we can actually start approaching things from different directions, finding commonalities, which I think is really important. Like I know, for example, when I first started looking at my side of the analysis, and I was getting almost a little bit like worked up, like, oh, this isn't fair, it's all greenwashing, and I was getting quite passionate about it, but I don't have that insight of the tourism sector that Carol can bring to the table. So yeah, I think it starts with us, essentially.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. Any questions?
I can say. Oh, sorry, Laura. I was going to say I can just say something here, because I think that the way that academia currently is positioned in the UK, we have an impact agenda, and so there is a lot of pressure on UK based academics to not only do research, produce research, but that research has to demonstrate or have some sort of impact beyond the academic sphere, so in society, culture, and so on. So in a sense, I think that because we have that pressure already, I'm actually going to see it as a positive, because it does make us think about ways in which we can take our research and try to, engage with different organizations and different communities. And perhaps that and that particular context for research in the UK, I'm going to say is actually a benefit. And I'm saying that with certain reservations, because when it was first introduced, and this idea that our research and the impact would be measured, people were absolutely horrified, because we would say, well, what's going to happen to blue skies thinking? What's going to happen to, just critique? What is going to happen to the sort of work that doesn't necessarily, let's say, lend itself directly to having some sort of impact beyond academia? And so I think that still stands as a criticism of the way in which there's a kind of that expectation is there. But still, I also think that there's something positive now in terms of us being enabled in many ways to engage beyond academia in ways that maybe we wouldn't have been able to before.
Thank you. And also a nice positive spin to put on all the work I know you've had to do to to make claims about impact. So it's good that you still see it you can still see it in a positive way. It's true. Okay, we've got a question in the chat. Tom, I don't know if you want to speak or if you'd rather I read it out. It's up to you.
Oh, sure. I can read it. I can read it out. I was struck. This question is for Claire. I was struck that how strange it is that talking about animal ethics isn't helping in convincing people to develop animal ethics, and it almost seems to put a muzzle on the things we actually care about in aid of that pragmatism. And I have some friends who do work for vegan outreach here in the United States, and they told me that the people who go vegan for health reasons, for example, or for other kinds of reasons like that, tend to be temporary vegans, as opposed to the people who go for animal ethical reasons tend to have more longevity, tend to be more likely to stay that way for life. And so I guess my question was, if we calculate the success of veganism by the number of animals who are not dying, is there a benefit to kind of arguing for an animal ethical position, knowing that you'll get fewer vegans, but that those vegans will last for longer, and therefore more animals will be saved in the long run? Is there a way to kind of quantify that, or to come to some kind of statistical model of how many animals per person we can save by different strategies that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. Thanks, Tom. There's probably going to be quite a long answer to this. So the first thing is that that's absolutely true. The studies demonstrate that people who become vegan for animal ethics reasons are more likely to stay vegan. However, there was some very interesting findings that we had from the research that we did, which was we did focus groups with people who you would think of as being traditionally incredibly difficult to reach with a pro-vegan message. And that was people over the age of 65. And when we did the focus group with them, what was really interesting was that every single person in the focus group actually excluded some sort of animal-based product from their diet or from their lives. And when I spoke to them, what was really interesting was to find out that not only did they exclude, but they excluded long-term. So these are people that traditionally are hard to reach. However, they were talking, for example, about everybody in the focus group that I did who was over the age of 65, every single one of them excluded veal and would not have veal. And they all talked about a welfare campaign that had happened, I mean, decades ago. They all talked about that this was something that they had done and they had stuck with for decades. So there's something really interesting, and this is why we need much further research on it, because we genuinely do not know yet how these things work. And I only introduced this particular example of the older people who were excluding for, and we're talking, 50 or more years. I introduce this because I think that it throws into doubt, first of all, this idea that because other people, that people talked about excluding it because of an animal welfare campaign, but also they talked about, for example, excluding red meat because of health concerns, and they've done that now for 20, 30 years, that they were opposed to farming, and they talked about it in very nostalgic ways and said things like, oh, farming's not the same as it was, and it was much healthier and it was better for the animals, and so they were actually reducing or cutting down and so on because of that, and because of for health reasons as well. So we got some really interesting, I think, information from those focus groups with people who were over the age of 65, and it was unexpected. However, what we did see was that those were people absolutely who responded best to health messages. Now, there is, and again, I think that we need much more research in this area, and certainly I think we're moving towards it, but definitely there's so many questions there that we need to answer. There is the question about those people who come to veganism and transition for health reasons and then end up staying for the animals, and that happens as well. And there's definitely studies that demonstrate that potentially is another route. So I think that, just to answer your question, I do think that we need various different strategies, and I don't think that we should exclude the health and environmental messaging, because there are ways in which everybody transitions in a different way, and if those messages are out there and then people are introduced to the animal ethics message as well, there's a degree of evidence that says that those people will then transition and then potentially stay vegan. So I do think that we need much more research, and this is only one study, and I can only sort of talk from the evidence that we had from that. But I do think that it shows up some very interesting very interesting, I'm going to say, curveballs, and particularly those ones around older people and people who have excluded for many, many years. So it suggests to us that potentially those people would transition to veganism and then stay vegan, even if it was for health reasons, for a long time. So again, that was really interesting, is when, again, in the focus groups, they did say once they've made those decisions, they actually stick with those decisions, and they become very kind of entrenched in their practices, and they're not really about changing those practices. So complicated, we need more research. But I think that there's evidence there that we have to use all the different strategies at our disposal. And yes, it's uncomfortable from a caste position, and I'm certainly uncomfortable. You know, I would love it that people became vegan, you know, for animal ethics reasons. However, when we see that those other messages, when the Vegan Society used it in their different campaigns, those messages reached people. And then is that potentially a gateway and a way into introducing people to the animal ethics message from there? So I think we have to just be, we need multiple strategies, and we have to think maybe more about these kind of bringing these different strategies together, and, you know, drawing them in maybe more complex ways than we have done previously.
Claire, do the groups that you worked with track their, I don't know, converts over time? Or is the conversion part the last contact they ever have with them?
Oh, so you mean the oh, sorry, I was just talking about other studies there as well, which are about people
Right.
who've moved to veganism. So that was just from another study, but the yeah, the people that we spoke to were all non-vegans, so vegetarians as well. And that was interesting, because what we found was that obviously vegetarianism is actually a gateway to veganism, and that vegetarianism, strangely enough, vegetarianism is more ambiguous in a sense than veganism with the people that we spoke to, because people who identified as vegetarian were actually excluding beyond what we might think of as a vegetarian diet, and was saying, actually, you know, I'm not sure, I'm vegetarian, but I'm not quite vegan, but I'm nearly there. I mean, it was interesting that actually people saw veganism as something quite precise and well-defined, but vegetarianism was much more flexible and was maybe moving towards veganism. It was kind of getting pulled towards veganism.
Interesting. Thanks. That's interesting.
Thank you. I realise I've got a few questions now, but I realised that I totally missed Rita. I apologise, Rita. Rita, who asked Claire for her potential reactions to Gunda, the film.
I'm sorry, I've not seen it yet.
Well, at least that means I can get to the next question. Sorry about that, Rita. I totally missed that. And then, so now, even though I have a follow-on question from Jess, I am going to go to Camilla, because she's had her virtual hand up for a while there. So Camilla, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, hello, can you hear me? Sorry, right now I cannot turn my camera on, so I left actually a question in the chat box, but maybe that was missing. Anyway, I would like to ask Sezen what she thinks about the two documentaries that were, one, Katie, which is about the cats that live in Istanbul, and the other one that is trade. And I would like to get in touch with her later, maybe, if it's possible. So
of course,
thank you.
That's more than possible. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you very much
question.
to all of you. I was just trying to be very short, to not steal time to anybody. Thank you.
Well, I haven't watched these documentaries, I'm afraid, but I know a lot about them. I have seen them, you know, in promotions. I think there are stray cats and dogs are portrayed really positively in those documentaries, I believe. Is that so, Camilla? I think there's positive portrayal of stray cats.
Katie, yeah, in Katie they are portrayed, very, very positively, and also the relationship that they have with the inhabitants is very it's good, and I know that there are activists that do not agree with this vision, because of course there is violence, there is death, that there are a lot of things that are going on. So, but actually the documentary is beautiful, because of course it tries also to send a certain type of message, which probably is also related to the life of the people that lives in Istanbul, that is very conflicting in some way, because these animals are so important for the identity in some way of the city. But at the same time, you know, there is a concern for them, of course.
Well, I'm again, I haven't watched the documentaries, but I think for a foreign point of view, they look really good from outside, but in reality, it is not the same. You know, I have saved my cat from the streets as well. There are deaths every day. We see dead cats and dogs every day. We try to feed them on the campus or on the streets, but not everyone is positive about those feedings as well. So of course, it's a good thing those documentaries are good to send out messages, but I think it's partially true for us, for the reality, for representing the reality.
Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you, Sezen. So Jess had a quick follow-on question for Claire regarding the over 65s in your group and the references to historical animal welfare campaigns. Jess asked, do you think, oh, sorry, I'm speaking for you, Jess. Do you think past campaigns were more effective? And is there just too much going on now that people are overwhelmed by ethical calls to action?
That's such a great question. I do not have an evidence-based answer for that, though. I think it's really, yeah, you know what? I think that just bearing in mind the amount of calls for our attention from the various different media platforms that we have, I could imagine that is very possibly the case, but I couldn't say for sure with any evidence to back it up. But I think that's perfectly plausible. Yeah. I mean, the campaign that they talked about was from the 1980s, and I think that this kind of the veil campaign. In fact, it was one that when we talked to even people who were younger, they knew about it, and certainly when it came to veal, even with the younger age groups, everybody was talking about, well, I eat this, but I wouldn't eat veal. So there's something there that's happened, and those were people who were younger, who would not have remembered that particular campaign. But yeah, very possibly all the calls for our attention are perhaps making it difficult to have, a particular voice heard or a particular campaign heard now.
Thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, there was another question, but I believe it's been answered in the chat there. But Rita did, going back, because I think I maybe didn't express her question quite right, was more interested in if you've heard any reactions to the film, Gunda, Claire, or anyone. Does anyone know? Has anyone heard anything about whether or not they did a good job there? I think it's hard because no one's been able to go anywhere to watch films.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it. I haven't seen much in terms of the critical or the public reception yet. But yeah, it'll be really interesting. Absolutely, from what I know of the film, it'll be really interesting to see. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's 3:30, so it's time for a break. thank you so much once again to all four speakers. Really, such fascinating papers that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think fostered a really interesting discussion there. So thank you so much, and enjoy your break, and we will be back here, sort of, you know. See you in half an hour.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you
Thank
soon.
you. Yes. Thanks.